We have unconfirmed reports this morning that a plane has crashed into one of the towers of the World Trade Center.
There's a huge pall of smoke coming from that direction.
Alrighty, welcome to episode 28 of Phumblepodcast. Today is the 20th anniversary of September 11th, and I wanted to dedicate this week to talking about the memories and also the before and after of 9/11. With a good friend of mine who's actually a high school teacher of history and government here in California. And without further ado, he's David Gray. Thanks for joining me, man.
Oh, glad to be here.
Appreciate it. So to start off, I mean, 20 years has passed. I can't even believe that already it's been 20 years. I mean, it still feels like yesterday, some of the effects that were felt. Let's start with discussing where you were and how you remember when the events unfolded on this day 20 years ago.
Yeah, it's one of those days in history that always stands out. Previous generation remembers when Pearl Harbor was attacked. They remember when they were. So every single generation seems to have that one day, that one moment or one event that forces you to remember where you were. People remember where when Pearl Harbor was attacked. People remember where they were when John Kennedy was killed. People remember where they were when 9/11 occurred. And I happened to be overseas teaching. I taught overseas. I was in Qatar for 6 years. Before that, Kuwait for 2 years. Well, in 2001, that was the first time I was overseas living abroad teaching, and I was in Warsaw, Poland. And I had arrived in August, and then the next month, I arrived August 6th in Poland. The next month, obviously, 9/11 happened, and this was in 2001.
Wow.
So it was the first time living abroad in a different country. And when this thing happened, we got a call that day to meet in the commons area of the school I was working in. And, you have to understand that we were 6 hours ahead of East Coast time in Poland.
Yeah.
It's 9 hours ahead Pacific time, but on the East Coast, it's 6 hours ahead. So we were told when the planes hit, live, when they hit, we met with the director of the school and he let us know that the country was under attack. And he told us to go home. And so when I went home, I put CNN on in my apartment and I watched the towers burning and I watched them fall live, but I was overseas when it happened. And it was about, I guess when the towers were hit by the planes, it was about 3:30 in the afternoon in Warsaw time.
Right.
And we all went home and we were watching the towers fall live. And my mom and dad were both raised in New York. I was born in New York, and I have many relatives still living there. And so, like, I called up my brother, who was living in Los Angeles at the time, and I asked him what was going on. And he said, "Well, the country's under attack." And I clearly remember asking him, "Well, what are we going to do now?" And he said, "We have to declare war on somebody." And my brother, though, doesn't believe in war or violence. He is for gun control. He's against, gun violence. But he told me clearly, though, that the country has to respond and declare war on somebody or something.
Yeah.
Which in this case, it was the war on terror. But that's where I was, though. And like I said, it was a weird experience because it was my first time living abroad. And this is what's happening to the country.
Yeah. That's
interestingly. The previous April, I had organized and led a field trip to Washington, D.C. and New York, 8th grade field trip. And I was in charge of it. I organized and led it. And so we actually, took the kids to New York, the 8th graders. It was during spring break in April of 2001. And we went to Liberty Island and Ellis Island. When I was on Liberty Island, I had one of the students take a picture of me with both twin towers behind me.
wow.
And I said, I'm hanging up in my classroom right now. And so, little did I realize, though, that 5 months later, though, they would be gone. But it's a really beautiful picture of the twin towers behind me, and I'm standing on Liberty Island.
Man, that is I mean, talk about timing, right? With all of that. And it's it is probably even a more specific and probably a little more scary when you initially hear about these attacks in a different country, in Poland, of your home state, and of course the neighboring states of the capital, Washington D.C., and the flight that landed in that the passengers actually prevented it from hitting its intended target, right, in Pennsylvania. What was going through your mind when you hear the initial word from when you're in school, what you said, it's about 3:30 when you got home in Warsaw time, right?
Right.
So at about what time, how soon after the first airplane hit the North Tower, how soon did you get notified of that after it actually happened?
Well, I guess almost immediately. Like I said, because Warsaw is 6 hours ahead of East Coast time.
Yeah.
And
so where were you in relation to Warsaw? Like, were you at the school, or were you coming home? Were you outside the school?
We were all at the school still when we were told by the director to meet in the commons area, and he informed us of what had happened. So we got that information. We were notified at the school.
Right.
So all of the expat teachers were called in the commons area, and the director of the school notified us of what was happening.
Wow.
And told us that the Twin Towers had been attacked.
Yeah.
And we didn't know by whom yet. We didn't know if it was the country. And so the director told us, what happened, and told us all to go home to try to call loved ones if we had any loved ones in New York, if we knew any family, but to watch the news. And so, like I said, both of my parents grew up in New York, and I was born there. And my cousin was still living there. My mom's sister's daughter, my cousin Laura, was still living in New York at the time. She was practicing law there. And so I was just trying to find out if anything happened to her. I had great aunts and great uncles still living there.
Yeah.
My cousin Frank's mom was still living there, my great aunt Rose.
Yeah.
And so, well, I mean, again, my mom's cousins were all there still.
Yeah. So your first instinct once hearing of the news is my family okay? And that's reasonable because they lived in the state. So
yeah. And so I after, I actually called my mother first. So I called my mom and dad first, and they both live in California. And I asked them, if they had heard anything from any relatives living in New York. My dad's best friend, my Uncle Joe, was living in New York. She still lives there at the time. He still lives there now. He was living there at the time. And so I asked if they had heard from any of the relatives and if they were okay. I called my older brother Daniel after that and asked him, what's going on, because they were getting information that we, probably weren't. I mean, I was watching CNN, but I was just asking them, what have you heard? What's going on?
Right. Well, the reason I ask all that is because, I mean, I'm comparing your experience in getting this initial news of the attacks, and you got it through word of mouth first. You didn't see it. So, and you got it, it looks like after the second plane hit, and that's when they told you both towers have been attacked. At your school. Right. Well, yeah, because so 20 years ago, I would have been 15 years old, right? So I'm a freshman in high school, or maybe sophomore, I believe, actually. So I may have been a sophomore if I remember correctly. I grew up in Maryland, right? So this is where I went to school in Montgomery County, Maryland, and not too far from the events. And so what happened was I walked in to our first period class, and I see that the TV is on, and there's the North Tower is in smokes. So the first plane had already made contact, and it was about, I want to say 8:40 roughly. You know the time better than me. I think it was around 8:40, 8:50 when I walked into the class, and then that first plane had already hit. And I'll be honest, I thought it was a movie. I didn't even think like my initial reaction was like, oh, this is a movie. And then my small-mindedness at that time, I'm thinking, okay, we're going to watch a movie today, not having any clue that my teacher's face is pale white, like in worry. She's sickly, worried, and scared, and trying at the same time to manage a classroom. And then we were just awaiting a word from our principal as to what's next. And so then as we were waiting, the TV was still on, and we all see the second plane, and as many have we see the second plane hit. And that's when it all like that it all became real, like for me. And that's when we realized, oh my God, this is actually some sort of attack. And they started announcing that on the news, like, we believe we're under attack. We don't know who the culprit is. We don't know who's behind it. So everything was still vague and unclear. And then so shortly thereafter, around 9:30 or 10, before 10 a.m. that day, Tuesday, it was a Tuesday, September 11th, 2001. And the principal sent us home. Everybody went home. I get home, and I'm just, trying to figure out what's going on. And cell phones, by the way, for a lot of the younger, you have kids, and they're younger generations. The cell phones were still not even that. We didn't have iPhones. We barely, and at that time, I think my family shared one cell phone, right? So it was still a newer technology, and I say that to make a clear picture as to how communication was tougher, right? So So when my dad comes home a few hours later, he tells me that I hadn't even learned yet about the Pentagon, the attack on the Pentagon or Pennsylvania. Um, my dad comes home and I said, "Did you see? Do you know what's going on?" He's like, "Yeah, I saw the Pentagon plane fly over my head." He saw the thing in person, and the reason why is because he was working as a construction worker across from the Pentagon. He wasn't working.
You saw the plane that hit the Pentagon then?
Yeah, he saw it go over his head and he thought nothing of it until like 15, 20 seconds later when he heard a huge explosion. And then he noticed the smokes. And then I believe his company said that he needs to go home as well for safety measures. So that's how I learned about the Pentagon, So
how wild. I didn't know your dad saw the plane.
Yeah, he told me. And I remember all of this vividly, even though it was 20 years ago. So then I turned the TV on again, and that's when I learned about the fourth plane in Pennsylvania. So, experience. How old would you have been in 2001?
33 when it happened. I was turning 34 that October, but I was 33.
Yeah, 33. So, I mean, you were roughly around my age now. So the experience, yeah. So not to age you, but I'm just.
Well, you had asked before, like, what was my feeling at the time, and
yeah,
one of my students who was Polish actually interviewed me after the attacks happened, because she was writing for like some local newspaper or something, and. My initial reaction and feeling was fear, and then it quickly turned to anger, is what I told her. That our country had been attacked and all those people had died. And so, I believe strongly that there needed to be, though, a response from our country.
Yeah.
Like what my brother had talked about. And so, we as Americans kind of live in a bubble. And like even my brother had said, this was kind of like the price we pay for democracy.
Yeah.
We live in a bubble in the sense that all the wars that have been fought on, all the wars that America's fought have been on, different continents, different countries. The last time a war was fought on our soil was the American Civil War.
Yeah.
And like I like to tell my students that the last time that the United States was actually invaded by a country was in the War of 1812 by England. Yeah. The last time that, the country was the mainland United States, the contiguous United States, last time it was attacked by a country was in the War of 1812. Because when you talk about Pearl Harbor, it was attacked by the Japanese, but Hawaii was not yet a state. It was a territory of the U.S., and that's not part of the contiguous 48 states, right? The mainland 48 states, right? Like Hawaii and Alaska aren't attached to the 48. And like I said, I tell my students that Pearl Harbor, when it was attacked by the Japanese, it wasn't an invasion either, though. That was just an attack. The Japanese didn't invade Hawaii. They attacked it, and Hawaii wasn't part of the contiguous U.S. states. And like I like to tell my students that the United States is the most well-defended country in the world, geographically. For example, if anybody wants to attack us or invade us, they have to cross 3,000 miles of ocean, either the Atlantic Ocean or Pacific Ocean. So like if any country from Europe wants to attack the US or invade the US, they have to cross 3,000 miles of the Atlantic Ocean. If any country in Asia wants to attack us or invade us, they have to cross 3,000 miles of the Pacific Ocean. Yeah. Or they have to go through Canada or go through Mexico to attack us.
Right.
So it's the most defended country in the world. And I also explained that two countries that border each other, Canada and the US, have the longest peaceful relations between two countries that border each other in the history of the world. Mm-hmm. So any two countries that border each other in the history of the world, Canada and the US have the longest peaceful relationship among any two countries or between any two countries.
Right.
So, like I said, we live in a bubble, though. We haven't had a war fought on our soil since, again, 1865. And for this to happen to us on our own soil is surprising. And again, it was a shock to everybody, and we're still feeling the effects of it.
Yeah. As the details unfolded, for the days and months to come, following the attacks, and when, which eventually led to the 20-year war that essentially just, we just pulled out the last troops, right? This is what led to all of that. This was the longest war in American history, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yeah, it's the longest war in the sense that, well, you have to understand too, like I tell my students that, Congress has the power to declare war and not the president. And, a lot of these conflicts aren't declared wars. We've only declared war 5 times, Congress has.
Yeah.
You have the War of 1812, you have it's the Mexican-American War, the Spanish Civil War. I'm sorry, the Spanish American War, when we went to war against Spain, and then you have both world wars. Like Korea and Vietnam weren't declared wars by Congress. So there were military actions or conflicts, right?
Right.
So this
right.
war on terror, though, isn't an actual declared war, but it's the longest war, if you will, or military engagement in the history of the United States. But it wasn't against a certain country; it was just on terror, right?
Right.
So we have to make that distinction that, we say, well, it's the longest war America ever fought. Well, one, it wasn't against a country. It's against, an idea, right? Terrorism. And it wasn't a declared war by Congress anyway. We were engaged.
I understand. I can distinguish the difference now, or I can see the difference between the two. Now, like you said, it went from fear to anger for you, the initial shift in your feelings and reaction. But like you said, we hadn't had foreign attack on our soil since 1812, right? So the fact that this was able to be hidden, or and I don't want to get into the conspiracy theories, I'm only looking at the facts, but how would you describe their plan and how they were able to get away with it ultimately, to be able to come to the point of 9/11 as it happened? How long were they working on this plan, if you want to enlighten us on this?
Well, I know they were here for a year. The 19 terrorists who, had not only organized it, but carried it out. They were here for at least a year. Well, for about a year from what I've read.
Right.
But the reason why they were able to carry it out is just because our security agencies don't work well together. They don't share information. They don't communicate with each other.
Yeah.
And so I'm talking about like the CIA, FBI, all the different agencies, though, within the federal government, they don't share information and they don't work together. They keep information from each other. That's one. And so really, though, our American government failed the American people. And that's the bottom line. And our security's never been that great anyway. It's not like on the same level as the British or the Israelis. Our security has always been rather weak.
Yeah.
When you look at how easily, like, the Soviets stole, information about the atomic bomb, and they were able then to detonate their own, create their own.
Yeah.
American intelligence hasn't been on the same level as other countries. It's always been far behind, in my opinion.
Okay.
Like I said, it's behind the Israelis and the British, obviously, and even the Soviets, now the Russians. But it was a failure on the part of the federal government to prevent this from happening. And it should have never happened. It should have been prevented. And you could see, though, the results afterwards, though, like Homeland Security, was created, right?
Right.
A new cabinet, a new department was created, from all of this.
Yeah.
And there were measures put in place that forced the agencies to start to share information with each other and better communicate. But the reason why it happened was because our intelligence and our security, though, just failed us.
Right.
It's the bottom line.
And unfortunately, 3,000 plus lives had to be lost in order for it to get stronger and for us to
I
learn.
actually think, what is it? Is it 2,995 or something?
Is that the exact number? Yeah, I'm giving a estimate based on my rough research on it. And obviously, you know, these victims will never be forgotten. They're heroes.
I stand corrected. It's 29. I'm looking it up. It's 2977, but 2996, including the terrorists themselves.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
And I actually know the exact figure for Pearl Harbor. It's 2,403. I have that number stuck in my head.
Wow.
So there were more people who died, though, from the 9/11 attacks than the attacks at Pearl Harbor. 2,403 to 2,977. I don't want to include the terrorists who were.
Yes.
Killed.
Right. They were the perpetrators. They were not. Go ahead.
Oh, let's make that clear. You have to understand too that they were terrorists who committed this act. They weren't representing a country.
Yeah.
And so, like, when I talk to students about this,
right,
that America, hasn't been attacked, by a country since, obviously, attacked on our mainland, since the War of 1812. Those terrorists weren't representing a country.
Yeah.
And actually, when Osama bin Laden was killed, I was in my first year teaching in Kuwait.
I see.
And I remember having this conversation with my Kuwaiti students, when Osama bin Laden was killed, and then when he was buried at sea, that day we got an email sent to all of us to be sensitive, because I'm teaching at an Islamic school.
Yeah.
And I remember my Kuwaiti students asking me if I had a problem with the way that Osama bin Laden was buried. I said I did not have any problem with that at all. And they were kind of like shocked. And I said, let me explain myself. And I said, they gave him a proper Islamic burial, even though it was at sea. But I said, what did they expect? What did you expect them to do? Hand the body over where it could be a shrine for people to come and honor, or be a martyr for other terrorists? Yeah. And then I added this though. And I said, that's the thing though. I told my students that Osama bin Laden is not Muslim, because I know Muslims, though, weren't responsible for 9/11. Now, all of my students are Muslim.
Yes.
And I told them that Osama bin Laden, no, is not a Muslim. He was a terrorist. If he was a Muslim, then a Muslim would be responsible for 9/11. But I said to them, I know in Islam, they don't teach that.
Yeah.
So Osama bin Laden is not Muslim. He was a terrorist. So that's why I have no problem with what they did to him.
Right.
Burying him at sea like that.
Yeah. Can you remind me of the exact date of when they killed him, or not the exact date, but the year?
I think it will. I mean, it was like April 2011. I think it was.
Right. I believe you're right.
Look it up real quick. It was in 2011, and I think it was in. It was actually March. It was March 2011. Sorry, no, May. Sorry, it was May. May. I'm looking at it right now. It's May 2nd, 2011.
May 2nd, 2011. That's when. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so
May 2nd, 2011.
Man, so that's another unique experience, to be teaching in a Muslim country while and they're not related. We're not saying that this is related. We're just, but there are some confusions out there about this, and we want to clarify that, as you very adequately mentioned, that Islam wasn't responsible. A terrorist group was responsible, and Osama being the leader of that. So to turn it on to a bit of a more, positive light, 20 years has now passed. The security is much improved. Airport security, especially. I mean, I'm just thinking, before this event, you were able to literally take a handgun onto the flight, and it was safe to do so, and they would allow you they could check it in, and you could carry it on. And obviously now you can't even take a water bottle, right? It's gone that
It's more than that too. I mean, I was born in 1967, and of course, I flew on planes in the 70s and 80s and 90s. And I was just watching this movie the other day, The Family Man, starring Nicolas Cage, right?
Okay.
And if you remember The Family Man starring Nicolas Cage, at the beginning and even at the end of the movie, they show Nicolas Cage with Tia Leone, the actress, and they're at the airport. And he actually, at the beginning of the movie, she walks him to his gate. At the end of the movie, he follows her to the gate, and you can't do that anymore.
Right.
So
Right.
airport, though, it used to be that you could walk, though, the passenger, your family, your friends could walk you all the way up to the gate and to see you off.
Exactly.
Obviously, it doesn't happen anymore.
I mean, I arrived in the United States at Dulles Airport in Virginia in 1995, and all of our family that was already in America at the time, they met us right when we came out of the plane, like literally at the terminal, right?
Right.
So that doesn't happen anymore, and so this
That's
is
another good point, though. Like when you came out of the terminal, right out of the gate, you're walking off the plane, you could be greeted by family and friends. That doesn't happen anymore.
That doesn't happen anymore. Yeah. So, my own personal opinion on wars and the whole thing, I feel that is, I just feel like war doesn't ultimately solve the real issue, right? I think the real issue needs to be solved by communication and elimination of greed and power and uh, the the chasing of dominance over the rest of the world, or another country, even in this case, or another, even a terrorist group. I think to really gain peace, it must come from some sort of peace, some sort of purity. I mean, to button this whole thing up, I just wanted to know, like, when you're teaching history now in an American school, in an American high school, when you go over the events, because all these kids that you're teaching in high school weren't even born when it happened. So what kind of, like, usually what are some common questions you're getting about it, or opinions from the kids?
Well, to be honest, I was talking about it with another teacher. He teaches right next to me, and he mentioned to me after school yesterday that he didn't bring up 9/11, and I actually didn't bring up 9/11 either.
Oh,
But it wasn't conscious. I know it's the 20th anniversary, but I taught 3 government classes yesterday, and I just continued with the unit, which was the 14th Amendment. And he was teaching 3 government classes, and we both teach U.S. history classes as well, but on even days. But we didn't even bring up the events of 9/11. Now we have brought up, we do current events, we have brought up what's happening in Afghanistan and the withdrawal of American troops.
right.
And I compare it to what happened in Vietnam when the US withdrew. But I mean, if students ask questions and, if I do bring it up, and I brought it up in the past about what happened at 9/11, and I've told students already this, though, when we've talked about what happened in Afghanistan and why the US is leaving. We've had a long conversation about this with my students. And I showed them pictures of that cargo airplane filled with 640 people or whatever it was. And I showed them the video footage of people trying to, get on a plane to get the hell out of there.
Yeah, it's sad.
Flight. It is sad. First of all, I have no problem at all with going after the people responsible for 9/11. I just don't. I have no problem with the US going into Afghanistan initially and taking out the Taliban because they're harboring those terrorists who were responsible for 9/11.
Right.
Now, that doesn't mean I agree with us staying there and forcing Jeffersonian democracy down a people's throat that's never had it. And that's a problem. And that's what I think the US doesn't understand. And I've talked to my students about that. We feel that democracy is the best way. And that may be true, but it has to be organic. It has to come naturally. organically
from
from
within.
the people. You can't
Yeah.
force feed it down somebody's throat.
Yeah.
And they've never had it in that region.
Yeah.
You know, and you're seeing the effects of that even in Eastern Europe, though. I'm reading this book right now, The Light That Failed, and how democracy has failed in Eastern Europe in countries like Poland and Hungary.
Yeah.
And, you know, after the Velvet Revolution of 1989, and when, you know, communism fell in Eastern Europe, and even in the Soviet Union, when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, you could see that it's really not working like we thought it would.
Yeah.
Democracy, I mean. And like I said, you know, in the Middle East, you know, they've never had true democracy where the people rule.
Yeah.
And so you couldn't expect the US to just go in there and, again, have people accept it readily and freely with open arms, because that's not going to happen.
I mean, you can argue that democracy within the United States has taken over 200 years to get to the point that it has, and it's still, there are certain flaws within the system that we're constantly dealing with and having to work through.
Well, absolutely, though, because obviously democracy includes equality, and obviously equality is one of those things that is not available to everybody in our country, right? When we talk about the 14th Amendment, like I just did this yesterday, we talked about the history of the 14th Amendment and how it includes the Due Process Clause, but also the Equal Protection Clause. And I taught my students yesterday that there were a number of Supreme Court decisions after 1868, when the 14th Amendment was ratified, that ripped the guts of the 14th Amendment. And I tell my students that, you know, the three branches of government need to work together. If they don't work together, then you have inequality, and you have civil rights being violated. And again, I explained that civil liberties and civil rights are two different things.
Yeah.
But what my point is, though, like when Congress passes an act or a law, the Supreme Court interprets and judges that act or law, but they also interpret amendments to the Constitution. And so the Supreme Court, in different decisions, like in 1876 and then in 1883, different decisions by the Supreme Court overturned acts passed by Congress that were granting protections to African Americans, but also those decisions then interpreted the 14th Amendment in a way that didn't protect African Americans.
Yeah.
And also allowed the South to uphold those Jim Crow laws where it was separate but equal, you know, which was later on declared inherently unequal. But, you know, Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 is the one that brought the hammer down and legalized segregation in the South. But, you know, my point is that when we talk about democracy not working in other countries, and like you said, it's not working here, you know, it doesn't always work here. Yeah. The US, like I tell my students, is a combination of different political systems. We're a democracy, we're a republic, we're a federalist system, but we're also a socialist system. We have elements of socialism.
Yeah.
And so we're not just one political system: republic, democracy, federalist, and socialist. And that's what makes this work. Now, as far as democracy goes, on a different tangent, next week's the recall election. And that's a perfect example I've told my students of democracy is the recall, which is the people have the ability to remove an elected official. And next week, on September 14th, the citizens of California will vote to either recall Gavin Newsom or not. And so that's a perfect example of democracy, though. So it works sometimes, and sometimes it doesn't work. But
I believe that I think the system, like you said, the U.S. isn't just a democracy; it's multiple different governments working together, and even then, there's still issues like we mentioned. So for Afghanistan or other countries in the Middle East, for this to be just dropped on them and expecting it to just switch overnight, it takes time. It takes time there. It's taking time here, and it's a culture change. It needs to be a much more sensitive approach, I think, and that, in my opinion, could be why the exit from Afghanistan feels like it was kind of in my opinion, a bit of a failure, the way it happened.
Well, it was a failure because, well, first of all, like this agreement was signed under Trump, but there should have been a better evacuation plan, and
Right.
it looked like it was just disorganized. They underestimated, the Taliban and how fast they would regain control of the government. But Biden, though, is to blame for that failure to have an effective exit plan.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know why they couldn't have an effective exit plan, because they knew this was coming.
So
Right?
they were aware, and it seems like they didn't let that stop them, in a sense.
They didn't do a very good job. They should have waited until, they had, the measures in place, and, like I said, just a better plan to evacuate not only American personnel, but also all the Afghanis who assisted the Americans while we were there.
Yeah.
But I do agree with your point about democracy, though. It's taken how long for the United States, to live up to its democratic principles, and
Right.
it's still a work in progress.
Yeah.
And you can't expect, some country then that's never had it, and it was forced upon, to happen even over 20 years. It's not going to happen.
It's not. Yeah, it takes time. And I always say on my social media posts, there's a belief I have, and it's actually part of the open of this podcast, and is one of the main reasons I wanted to start this podcast, was purifying the mind and purifying the world that we live in, and keyword being the world and the mind, right? But it starts with one person, and that takes an open-mindedness to learning, to to be inclusive with everybody, and thinking about others as much, or even first, or before thinking about oneself. And I view that as a much more effective way to move forward, for the future of not just the United States, but humanity and the world as a whole.
Well, let me ask you a question.
Go for it.
So, I mean, in light of what's happened, in Afghanistan and everything that we've been talking about, do you think the United States, as a world power, has a responsibility to get involved in world affairs, or do you think the United States should mind its own business and go back to being isolationist? And the United States was isolationist, and what a lot of people don't understand, and I tell my students this, obviously, when we study these things, World War I started in 1914, okay?
Yeah.
With the assassination of the Archduke. The United States did not enter the war until April of 1917, World War I.
Yeah.
World War II started September 1st, 1939. The United States did not enter the war until it was attacked by the Japanese December 7th, 1941. Mm-hmm. And the first troops didn't arrive in Europe until like February 1942, right? And after World War I, the United States went back to being isolationist, by the way. They didn't even join the League of Nations, which was created by Woodrow Wilson. Congress didn't approve the treaty, the Treaty of Versailles. Congress didn't approve it, so we never joined the League of Nations. We went back to being isolationists.
Yeah.
Isolationist, though, is one of those, weird terms, because we were involved in affairs in the Western Hemisphere, just not in the Eastern Hemisphere and in Europe. But we were still involved, though, like in Latin America and South America during that time. But we weren't actively involved in world affairs as far as,
other continents. Yeah.
Well, the Eastern Hemisphere goes.
Yeah.
And we didn't join the League of Nations after World War I.
Yeah.
So, does the United States, though, have a responsibility, or should it just mind its own business and go back to being isolationist?
I think every United States is in a privileged situation when it comes to the power that it has, right? There's a reason so many people from all around the world have chosen for years, decades, and even you could say centuries, to leave their motherland and come here, right? It's the melting pot, all the nicknames for this nation. And it can be a beautiful nation for that, right? It can be. however, I believe that in order to answer your question first, I think it should be involved in world affairs. But I think there's a much better way to do it than and the motive, I believe the motive has to be pure. If the motive is to do what the name of the country says, unite, right? It should actually have that be its forefront and motive. And I think on depending on who's running the country, which again the people are voting for, it can happen quicker, or it can happen slower. So what I'm ultimately saying is that I think all countries have a responsibility, because if we look at history, go back far enough, countries weren't, always a thing. It became a thing over time, right? Lines were drawn, borders were drawn, and that's the point. It was a human-made thing ultimately. So in order for this planet, and I always like to think as a planet and not as countries, because we are all part of it and we're all responsible for where it's headed. I think the best way to be involved in world affairs is with the motive of uniting and thinking about how to make this whole Pangea, right, be what it was, and actually work together. Not saying that we need to lift the lines between the countries. I'm just saying it doesn't have to be isolationist. It doesn't also have to be what just happened for 20 years, right? There's some, the motive was not pure enough, I don't think, and that's probably why it didn't ultimately work.
Well, I think the motives have to be more humanitarian and less about money. But money makes the world go around. It's not.
But that's also a human-made thing, right? I know. It's. I mean, we can go on and on about about that as well. But I think ultimately, yes, you're right. The humanitarian approach is the, and I think we're going that way, because these are all these mistakes that we're going to ultimately learn from, and it's filtering out all the it's purifying, right? We're purifying by, unfortunately, lives have been lost, right? Good people have lost their lives, and we're learning with every soldier that unfortunately was taken away. And I'm gonna even blow this up to a global view. Innocent lives in Afghanistan and in Iraq, in all parts of the world, are being lost because the people in charge are motivated by, like you said, the money side of things, as opposed to the humanitarian side of things. Now, there are a couple countries in the world that think about the human aspect more, and they're, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I feel like countries like Finland, or Norway, just in a lot of these issues that US and other countries are struggling with, they seem not to be. They seem to be, like education, for example. I feel like Norway is, if I'm not mistaken, they're one of the top educational nations as far as I don't even know the right term for that, but the studies, like the students are much more involved in school, or grades are on average better in countries like that. So I think those countries is a starting point. Let's talk to those nations. What are they doing, right? Let's put our egos aside as nations, as leaders of nations, and see, okay, what can we really do to improve the issues? Because war ultimately begets war, in my opinion. It ultimately doesn't lead to peace. There are peace treaties that are signed, but
well, that's another question entirely, though. Is war ever justified? Is there such a thing as a good war? You know,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's a deep topic, and we can probably spend hours talking about it. But the focus to, and I would love you to come back on, and we can discuss these other subtopics that have came up from the initial 9/11 discussion. But to bring it back, I read a quote regarding 9/11, and it said this, and I'm paraphrasing, but it said, a lot of lives were lost for us to learn to unite, right? And I think that means a lot. I think that says a lot just in those few words, and then I think it ended it with saying, next time, let's not let the lives be lost before we learn to unite. So, it was, and I believe that. I agree with that. So I think the people, and I think the fact that social media is getting so strong, it's letting the people communicate. And that's what I said in the beginning of this episode. I said communication is what was missing, right? And assumptions are made, or things are ignored for the chase of that money.
well, unfortunately, like you said, though, if events like 9/11 always bring people together,
Yeah.
and usually bring out the good in people.
Yeah.
But as you've seen from last year, though, our country is still divided, and we've
Sure.
always been divided, and that's because what makes this country great also divides us, and that's our diversity.
That's right.
Because we're such a diverse country,
Yep.
we're going to have these issues,
Mm-hmm.
and the issues that separate us, as far as racial inequality, social and civil unrest,
Yeah.
and again, just it's all because, though, of our particular nation and the founding fathers that didn't address certain issues in the Constitution.
Yeah. It's not a perfect system, right? We're not
No.
pretending that it is, but it's getting better. I think it's getting better and purifying the further we get into this nation's age, and as the years are passing. Now, we're still ways away from where we want to be, but I think, one day at a time, we learn, we stay humble as a nation and as a world, as a planet, and I think that is ultimately, like you said, the humanitarian way to is the best way to approach this. But hey, David, thank you so much for spending your evening with me on this Memorial Day. And we will always celebrate the heroes that fought from the firefighters side, and all the medical sides, and the people that were inside the Twin Towers and the Pentagon, and
many good people were lost. All of the first responders who died, sacrificed their lives
yeah,
to do their job.
Exactly. And they will never be forgotten. They will never be forgotten. So, David, I appreciate you coming on and sharing your experience about this special day. And I will want you back on to discuss many other topics from the historical aspect. And I know we both love sports, so we can talk
next time, maybe.
Yeah. Hey, yeah, much lighter topic. Absolutely. This has been episode 28 of Podcast with David Gray. We discussed 9/11. Make sure to subscribe to Podcast on YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, and I will catch you guys on the next one.
Thanks for having me.